So we are continuing our study this morning from the Paul's epistle to the Galatian brethren, and we are using this book of Galatians to do a study of the gospel, looking to see what are the characteristics of the gospel we can learn through Paul's writing to these Galatians. And our specific theme for our lesson today is the gospel for all. So by way of review, Patrick, if you could help me out with the clicker here. Thank you. By way of review, the epistle to the Galatians was written to this Roman province, kind of situated in the central area of Asia Minor. Galatia is kind of an elongated province. It has a northern area that we don't have specific records of Paul visiting. And then we have this more southern area where we know Paul visited numerous times on his missionary journeys to cities like Lystra, Iconium, Derbe. And so we kind of make a leap here to some extent, but generally believe that the actual recipients, the audience for this book or this epistle, were to these southern churches that Paul established on his first missionary journey and then visited again on subsequent missionary journeys. I'm going to have your help because I'm not getting this thing to work here. All right. So by way of timeline, you'll recall that Paul was converted on the road to Damascus, and then through a combination of Acts and Galatians, we know that he spent about 3 years before he ever visited the apostles and the church in Jerusalem. And that included at least some time in Arabia. So he was converted in Damascus, and then he spent some time in Arabia and then returned back to Damascus. And altogether from Galatians chapter 1, we know that was around 3 years of time. And then he had his first missionary journey. Around AD 48, Paul traveled to this area of southern Galatia, that province, and some other areas in the region. And then we also know, importantly, that the Jerusalem Council, recorded in Acts chapter 15, took place somewhere around AD 50. And the reason that is important is because many of the topics Paul discusses in the Epistle to Galatians revolved around this idea of should Gentile Christian converts be circumcised, and should they follow these kind of tenets of the Jewish faith, the Jewish religion. And we know that Paul doesn't reference that Jerusalem Council in his writing to the Galatians, and so that evidence of silence, the lack of reference to that important event, kind of leads us to believe that Galatians was written prior to that Jerusalem Council taking place. All right, and then we know Paul went on to visit these regions and others on 2 subsequent missionary journeys as well in the 50s AD. And so this puts the Galatian epistle writing somewhere around AD 49, if our timeline is accurate, kind of between his first missionary journey and the Jerusalem Council that we'll look at a little bit in class today, recorded in Acts chapter 15. Now, so as we said before, our theme for this quarter is what can we learn about the gospel from the book of Galatians? And we've had 2 classes before. We worked through the first chapter of Galatians. We began by looking at the first part of chapter 1, and we said that Paul is very clear in that first part of chapter 1 that there is but one gospel. So if you want to open up to Galatians, we'll do some reading here to get us started. Starting in Galatians chapter 1 and verse 6, just to review, Paul says, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. And then he goes on to kind of give this warning, but even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. And then he repeats the warning a second time as well. So Paul is very clear that there is one gospel, and these Judaizing Christians that are kind of sowing some problems in the church here, but also in the church more broadly speaking, are trying to, he says, distort or pervert the gospel. And he says there's not more than one. There's only one, a single gospel. Last week, Drew continued our study in the second half of chapter 1, where we saw that the gospel is divine. In the latter part of chapter 1, beginning in verse 11, working through, Paul really makes a defense for his apostleship. It seems that some of these Judaizing Christian brethren were calling into question Paul's apostleship because he was not part of the original 12 that were called by Jesus during his earthly ministry, but rather Paul was called after Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and ascension on the road to Damascus. So Paul has to make a case in chapter 1 to justify his apostleship. And he says there in verse 11, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel." So this message Paul is preaching that he's writing about here in Galatians, it is not from man. "No," he says, "I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ." The gospel is divine. The gospel is not from man, it's not from Paul. The gospel is from Christ. It is a divine gospel. And that's the second characteristic we can learn about from this epistle to Galatians. So we're going to move on now to chapter 2 and look and see how Paul describes the gospel being for all individuals, not just the Jews and not just the Gentiles, but both Jew and Gentile. The gospel is for all. All right, so if you get bored by history and timelines, I give you permission to zone out for a few minutes. But it's important, especially for what we're looking at today, to kind of see a little more detail about this timeline and how these different events kind of fit together. So, imagine you've got your phone right here, and we're going to kind of pinch and zoom in a little bit on this timeline to get some more detail about some of what's going on right here. So this is kind of what we looked at a while ago. We have Paul's conversion, then he goes off and spends some time in Arabia, and then eventually he has his first missionary journey. He writes the book of Galatians, and then we have that Jerusalem Council, and then on further down the line, we have his second and third missionary journey. Now, we know from both Acts and the Galatians that Paul makes a few different trips to Jerusalem. So he's going to visit the church, the brethren in Jerusalem, on a few different occasions. The first visit, he references right here, the very first part of chapter 2. So Galatians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, "Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me." So Paul is going to visit Jerusalem. He references it right here at least one time. And this is like right after he finishes that kind of 3-year time period there in Arabia. And then he will come back and visit Jerusalem at least one other time that we read about in Acts, and that will take place not too long before his first missionary journey. Now think about the timeline right here. So we've got like 14 years, Paul says right here, between his conversion and that second visit to Jerusalem. So 34 to 47 AD roughly. There's a 14-year time span that we can read about some of those events that take place throughout the book of Acts. But one very important event takes place during this 14-year time span that Paul doesn't really reference in Galatians, but we have a very detailed account of in the book of Acts. So what event can you think of that takes place during this 14 years in which the gospel for the first time was opened up to the Gentiles? Which apostle was it, and who was the first convert? All right, exactly. So Cornelius. So importantly, the conversion of Cornelius takes place at some point in time between Paul's 2 visits to Jerusalem. So just in context, think about this. Paul is converted. He goes away, spends time in Arabia kind of by himself, probably doing some ministry to people kind of in that area. And then he comes, and for the first time, he's going to visit the church in Jerusalem, where Barnabas and Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, and John, those pillars of the church, are going to be based. All right? And if you remember from Acts, when Paul makes that first visit to Jerusalem, nobody wants to have anything to do with him. They're afraid of him because they think he's still in search of Christians to put in jail, to persecute. But if you remember from Acts, who was it that actually was the one to welcome Paul, or he was still going by Saul at the time, into the brotherhood? Barnabas, the son of encouragement. It was Barnabas who would actually invite Saul or Paul into the fellowship during that first visit to Jerusalem. He doesn't spend too much time at that point, and then he's going to go off to Syria and Cilicia, and we don't really have a record of what happens there, but he does some ministry in those areas. All right, but during that time that Saul or Paul is away, after he first met Peter in Jerusalem, then Peter is going to have a vision from God. And that vision is going to be of a sheet being let down from heaven, and on that sheet were all mixture of animals, clean and unclean. And what does God tell Peter in that vision? Yeah, he says, rise and eat. And Peter says, I can't. These are unclean animals. And God makes it very clear to Peter that from this point forward, there is no division between clean, unclean, or it's really a metaphor for Jews and Gentiles. All right, God opens up the gospel to the Gentiles, and so he sends Peter to the household of Cornelius, and Peter's going to convert Cornelius and his household, and Peter will then come back and tell all the brethren about those events. So the gospel is opened up to the Gentiles during this time between these 2 visits that Paul has to the church there in Jerusalem. All right, so I'm not going to go through this in detail, but if you want to jot down any of this, this is the best, at least I and others can figure out, to kind of put the 2 accounts, the Galatian account and the Acts account, kind of together. So we have Paul's conversion, which is recorded in Galatians 1 that Drew looked at last week, and the more detailed account, of course, is in Acts chapter 9. Paul will then spend 3 years away, which we read about only in Galatians. And then also in Acts chapter 9 and Galatians 1, Paul references that first visit to Jerusalem. And then, of course, we have nothing according to Galatians, but we know from Acts that Peter preaches the gospel to Cornelius and his family. And then Galatians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, our story for today, our text for today, is Paul making that second visit to Jerusalem, which, if you want to turn back over to Acts, we'll just quickly read some context there. Acts chapter 11, verse 29. This is best guess as the parallel account from Acts of Paul's second visit to Jerusalem. And so he is at this point in time in Antioch. And in verse 29 of Acts 11, so the disciples determined, everyone according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. And they did so, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. So what was the context for Saul or Paul's second visit to Jerusalem? All right, he was bringing benevolence. He was bringing financial support to the brethren in Jerusalem because that was the center of the persecution. All right? The brethren in Jerusalem were under high levels of persecution. There was a lot of poverty within that group. And the Gentile or Roman brethren outside of Judea were actually sending support to those brethren there in Jerusalem. And so the context for Paul's second visit to Jerusalem that we read about here in Galatians chapter 2 is really one of benevolence. All right, so we'll go into the text in just a moment, but then later on, Paul is going to leave and go off on his first missionary journey, which is recorded in Acts 13 and 14. Barnabas is going to be his partner with that trip. And then following that missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas are going to end up in Antioch, okay? And there in Antioch, there's going to be one or maybe two different disputes that take place that we'll get into today. Disputes, again, over this idea of should the Gentiles be circumcised? Should the Gentile Christians follow these tenets of the Jewish law? All right. Following those disputes, sometime in that general time frame, Paul writes the epistle to Galatians. So these disputes, this sort of a controversy over should the Gentiles be circumcised, should they follow the Jewish dietary restrictions and purity and all these things, is very much on his mind when he's writing this epistle. Not just because it's a problem in the churches of Galatia, but because it's a problem in Antioch. It's a problem in Jerusalem. This same controversy over the Gentiles needing to be circumcised, needing to follow these Jewish laws, is not unique to Galatia. It's going on in Antioch, it's going on in Jerusalem, and Paul references these other conversations as his rationale, justification for why they should not be required of those in Galatia. And of course, that all culminates eventually in Acts 15 with the Jerusalem Council. Okay, so if you zoned out for a while, time to come back in. That was our timeline. That was our history lesson for the day. So now let's actually dive into our text. All right, so in Acts chapter 2, the first half that we'll look at today, we are going to look at this in the context of three different interactions that Paul makes with individuals. First, it's going to be his interaction with this young man named Titus. Second will be his interaction with the pillars of the church in Jerusalem. And then thirdly, his interactions with Peter specifically. All right, so that's our outline for the first half of chapter 2. Three interactions of Paul. So, first interaction is with this young man named Titus. So let's read the first three verses of chapter 2 of Galatians. Then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. I went up because of a revelation and set before them, though privately before those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek. All right, so who is Titus? This is the first account we have of Titus right here in Galatians. He is not mentioned in the book of Acts, although he is referenced in Corinthians. He's referenced in Paul's epistle to Timothy, and then Paul wrote a full epistle called the Epistle to Titus to this young man. So Paul references him in his writings. Paul actually writes a letter to Titus specifically, but he's not mentioned specifically in the book of Acts. So what do we know about Titus? Well, we know, number one, that he is a Gentile. All right, Titus is not a Jew. He's a Gentile. He was probably converted by Paul during part of Paul's early ministry, even before his first missionary journey, perhaps, when Paul was that kind of 14-year time span that we don't know a lot about what Paul was doing. He was ministering in Arabia. He was in Sicily. He was in these other areas we don't have a lot of record of. Somewhere along the way, Paul encountered this man named Titus and converted Titus, who was a Greek, a Gentile, and Titus would come to become one of Paul's close associates. He would travel with Paul on many of his journeys, and Paul was in many ways a mentor to Titus. Titus and Timothy had a lot in common in that regard. They were both probably young men that Paul took under his wing and really taught them to become preachers, ministers of the gospel. All right, so why is Titus mentioned right here in the first part of Galatians? I mean, Galatians is a relatively short epistle, but Paul takes the time to mention specifically Titus. Why would that be? Titus was a Gentile, and he was not forced to be circumcised by the brethren, by the apostles, right here in Jerusalem. This is, in many ways, a test case that Paul is using as evidence for his argument that Gentile converts do not need to be circumcised. He's going to make a few different arguments to that same point, but this is one of them. All right? Paul has a young convert, a young man. He is a Gentile. He is in Jerusalem. He is in the birthplace of the church. And he is with not just Paul and Barnabas, but he's with Peter. He's with John, the apostle whom Jesus loved. He's with James, the brother of Jesus. And those pillars, those influential members of the Jerusalem church, do not force Titus to be circumcised. That is pretty strong evidence that Paul makes right here that Gentile converts do not need to be circumcised or follow these basic tenets of the Jewish law. All right, so think about Titus here as not just the protege of Paul, but rather a test case that Paul is going to be using to justify and to verify the very point he's trying to make. Now, he makes this comment in the latter part of verse 2, and he says, I proclaim, the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles in order to make sure I was not running or had not run in vain. So he says, I go to Jerusalem with Titus, and I'm telling Peter and James and these influential members of the Jerusalem church about all that I've been doing, the gospel that I've been preaching. And he says, I do it to make sure that what I've been doing has not been in vain. Do you think that Paul's worried he's preaching the wrong gospel? Is he verifying that with Peter and the apostles there? No, Paul is very confident that he's preaching the one true gospel. He's already mentioned that in chapter 1. All right, he's not testing this out with Peter and James and John and the others to make sure that he's not in the wrong. What he's saying right here, at least the way that I read this, is when he says to make sure I have not run in vain, it's to make sure that what he's preaching, which is true, is not causing division within the church. Paul wants to make sure that the practices that are taking place here in Jerusalem, the birth of the church, are the same practices taking place out in these other areas where the Gentile brethren are living. That there is unity within not just the ministers, but there's unity within the brethren themselves. Because if he's preaching something over here, and they're doing something different in Jerusalem, well, that's going to undermine all the work that Paul is doing. Because that's going to be sowing discord. That's going to be sowing division. It's going to be causing a loss of unity within the early church, which is growing and spreading rapidly at this point in time. Paul is not concerned about his gospel not being accurate. He knows it's accurate. He got it from Christ by divine revelation. But he wants to make sure that there is a unified message, a unified gospel being preached, not just in Jerusalem, but everywhere else as well. So unity is very much on the forefront of Paul's mind when he comes here to Jerusalem. And so that is a pivotal thing that Paul is trying to ensure with this visit to Jerusalem. It's all about unity, making sure that we are a unified collective preaching a singular gospel. The gospel that is, in fact, for all, Jew and Gentile. All right, so then let me pick up at verse 4 and then read down through verse 10. And we're going to move on now to our second interaction with Paul. All right, yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery, to them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you and for those who seem to be influential. What they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. On the contrary, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. Only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. All right. So this next section, Paul is having an interaction, and he's discussing these events between himself and this group of individuals that he calls two things. He calls them influential members, or influencers, if you will, and he calls them pillars. So, think about influencers. You hear this word a lot in the context of social media, right? Influencers are people who have influence. They are individuals who, for better or worse, have sway over other people. And Paul doesn't name them specifically, but he references the pillars as being Peter or Cephas, James, the brother of Jesus, and John. And there may be other apostles that were here in Jerusalem or other leaders of the church that fall into this category. But in addition to Titus, Paul's second interaction that he uses as a justification for his audience here in Galatia is that the pillars, the influencers of the Jerusalem church and he were in lockstep. They were in agreement. They were unified in their approach, their thoughts about the gospel being not for the Jews alone, but also for the Gentiles. They were in lockstep over the idea that the Gentile converts did not need to be circumcised or follow these various laws of the old Jewish faith. All right, so think about these pillars as being Peter, being John, being James, brother of Jesus, and perhaps others that aren't mentioned by name. Now, through this interaction, there are individuals that he refers to as false brothers who were brought in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus so they might bring us into slavery. This is one of those compare and contrast that Paul uses in Galatians. Freedom versus slavery. What is that in reference to? What's the freedom that he refers to in a positive, and what's the slavery he refers to in the negative? All right, exactly. Freedom in the gospel, slavery in the old law. So why is the old law equated with slavery? Yeah, it's a check-off religion. You have a whole list of do's and don'ts that you have to check off and keep track of, essentially. All right? And he's contrasting these because with the gospel, it's freedom from this check-off religion. All right? But these false teachers, these Judaizing Christians, they're trying to still bring in all the aspects of the old law into Christianity. And he's saying right here, they're trying to get rid of your freedom, and they're trying to bind you once again to slavery. And Paul says, I don't want to have any of that. We got away from slavery in the old law, and now we have freedom. Why would you want to go back to slavery when we have freedom? And remember, he's talking to Gentiles, but also to Jews as well. The word slavery, what kind of memories does that bring back for Jews? Egypt, right? Slavery is it's a bad word within the Jewish group because they equate slavery with all that time in Egypt. All right? We might say nowadays, trigger warning. All right? Slavery is a trigger word for the Jews because it brings back a lot of bad memories of their time in Egypt. And Paul uses that. He wants it to be impactful. He chooses that word slavery for a reason. All right? Because he wants them to think that this old law and all that check-off religion, right, that is, he equates it to slavery, just like you experienced in Egypt. Why would you want to go back to that when we finally have freedom in the gospel, freedom in the Christian faith? And so he and the pillars there in Jerusalem are in lockstep. They are in agreement, but they do choose for some division of labor. Peter would focus on the Christians that are within the Jewish context, so mainly there in Jerusalem and Judea, whereas Paul was going to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. All right, so division of labor, but unity in the process. That's what it's all about. All right, when we work together, we can accomplish more, even if working together means we're going in different directions. Right? Sometimes we have to divide the labor up to get the work done, but when we are physically or geographically divided, we still have to be unified in mind and unified in message. And that's what Paul is ensuring right here. And then he's using that as justification for the Galatian brethren, his actual audience, to tell them Titus was not circumcised. Peter, John, James, they were right there with me on this decision. This is the right thing. This is the gospel of freedom. All right? Now, there is one request made in verse 10. So even though they divide their labor up, what's the one request that they make of Paul in verse 10? All right, remember the poor. Now, this can mean a variety of things, and Paul says the very thing I was eager to do. What poor specifically do you think that Peter and John and James and the Jerusalem church were thinking about when they asked Paul to remember the poor? Yes. Paul had already come to Jerusalem in the context of bringing relief. Remember? That was the reason for this visit to Jerusalem, or at least according to Acts, was he had left Antioch and he was bringing benevolence. He was bringing relief to those Jewish Christians there in Jerusalem. And they say, you're going to be going out to preach to all of these Gentiles in the Roman provinces. And they have a lot more than we do financially. When you go out and preach to all these Gentiles, please remember the needs of the Jews here in Jerusalem who are suffering with persecution, with poverty. And Paul was happy to do that. And we know that Paul followed through with that request. All right? Turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. Starting in verse 1. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. Paul asked the Galatian churches to do this, and now he's asking the church there in Corinth to do this. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift where? To Jerusalem. And if it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me. All right, now look over at Romans chapter 15. Beginning in verse 25. Well, I'll go back to 24. I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain, and to be helped on my journey there by you, once I have enjoyed your company for a while. At present, however, I'm going to Jerusalem. Why? Bringing aid to the saints. For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem, and they were pleased to do it. And indeed, they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings, they ought also to be of service to them in material blessings. So just in those two passages, we know that Paul followed through with this request. He brought relief to Jerusalem directly, like he carried it, or he sent others to carry that relief on multiple occasions. And in his writings and his visits, he reminded these Gentile brothers around the world at that point in time that the gospel started with the Jews, but has been shared with you as Gentiles. So in turn, I'm asking you to share your material blessings with those Christian brothers back in Jerusalem who are suffering with persecution and poverty. And that's a huge lesson for us right there, I think, right? We have brethren all around the world who are partners with us in the gospel. We are incredibly blessed materially, just as these Romans, the Gentile Christians, were blessed materially. And what does Paul ask of them? Send relief back to Jerusalem. Send financial support to those Christians who were suffering. All right, that was our 5-minute bell. So we got 5 minutes to go through our last interaction, and that's with Paul and Peter. So flip back over to Galatians. We'll read beginning in verse 11. All right, so there's some time that's passed right here. This is not like, the next day or anything. But at a different point in time, when Cephas, that's Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? All right, so what's happening right here? We've got Peter. Where's Peter's home base? Where does he live? Jerusalem, all right? Peter's home base is there in Jerusalem. He travels to Antioch, so he's a visitor. This is not his home territory. Antioch is really the home base for Paul and Barnabas. Peter's home base is back in Jerusalem. But Peter has traveled at some point in time to Antioch. So he is with Paul, Barnabas, and these Gentile Christians there in Antioch, visiting for whatever reason. All right? And Peter comes by himself initially, and he is eating with all of his Gentile brethren. But then at some point in time later, James shows up in Antioch with more of the Jewish brethren. So now we've got Paul and Barnabas and the Gentiles that live in Antioch. We've got Peter, who's visiting. And now we have James and other Jewish Christians that are also visiting. But what does Peter do once these Jewish Christians show up for their visit? He stops interacting with the Gentiles, and he clings to the Jewish brethren. Now, there could be two things going on right here, all right? And it's not clear from the text which one, or maybe some combination. It could be, number one, that literally Peter is just being a snob, and he refuses to sit at the table and eat with the Gentiles, and he's really just ignoring them and only associating with the Jewish Christians. But it also could be that while he's there by himself, he's eating all these unclean foods, which is perfectly okay because the Jewish law has been abolished. But when these Jewish Christians show up, and Paul refers to them as the circumcision party, that's his label for them, they are only eating kosher foods. They're only eating foods that are approved in the law of Moses. So it also could be that Peter stops eating these unclean foods and pretends to be a Jewish Christian and only eats the things approved under the law of Moses. Or it could be some combination of the two. Regardless, Peter is setting a very bad example. All right? He's being two-faced right here. He's being a hypocrite. When the Jews aren't around, he's happy to be with the Gentiles, eating their foods, associating with them. But when the Jews show up, he wants to save face. He wants to stay in their good graces. So he's going to begin to ignore the Gentiles, not eat their foods, and only eat the foods that the Jewish Christians, the Judaizers, the circumcision party are engaging in. Paul sees this for what it is immediately, and he has a confrontation with Peter. But what's so bad about this is not just Peter. Peter is influencing others to act the same way. Paul says even Barnabas, the son of encouragement, is being led astray by Peter's actions. And so because of Peter's, he's an influencer, remember? He's a pillar. Influencers can be great for good, but they can also be very strong for sin. And in this context, Peter, his influence is for the negative as opposed to the positive. And Paul uses this confrontation with Peter as his third evidence right here in this text about the difference between the old law and the new law, slavery versus freedom. And he tells Peter, you're wrong. And he uses that confrontation to tell the Gentiles, these Judaizers telling you have you circumcised, they're wrong too. Peter made a mistake. I confronted him, and assumingly, Peter rectified his ways. And so that's his third call to these Galatian brethren. All right, out of time for today. Thank you for your attention. Look forward to seeing you all in the worship hour.